Okay, so, like, have you ever felt like someone wasn't really saying what they meant, you know? Like that there was this whole other conversation happening under the surface.
Oh, absolutely. It's like we have this secret code we all use, but rarely talk about the language of the unconscious mind.
Right. And today we're going to try to crack that code. We're diving into some excerpts from expert conversational hypnotist Virginie Eymere's training program. She's got some pretty fascinating insights on how to read between the lines in any conversation.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about Imir's work is that she really emphasizes that these unconscious moments, these little slips, they're happening constantly, not just some rare thing.
So it's less about like those dramatic Freudian slips, like calling your boss mom,
Yeah.
and more about, I don't know, picking up on all those subtle cues that everyone's giving off all the time.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You're chatting with someone, right? And you ask them a simple question. They're like, yeah, sure, no problem. But then you notice their eyebrows like clench just for a second. Imir would say, pay attention. That disconnect, that's where the good stuff is.
That's wild. It's like when you can tell someone's lying, even though they're saying all the right words, you just like get a feeling.
Totally. It's about learning to trust your gut and paying attention to those little inconsistencies between someone's words and their body language, their tone of voice, even their silences.
Okay, so let's break down these unconscious cues, starting with like what we hear. What are some things we should be listening for?
All right. So when it comes to like auditory cues, really pay attention to any changes in someone's voice. Do they suddenly speed up when you mention a certain topic, or maybe they hesitate or sigh?
So it's not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it.
100%. And one of the most common and revealing things Imir talks about is contradictions. Like, imagine you're talking to a colleague and they're all, yeah, I'm always down to collaborate on projects. But then they add, almost under their breath, well, as long as it doesn't involve too many spreadsheets.
That little aside, that, oh, by the way, comment, that's
It,
significant.
totally, because it reveals something they might not even be consciously aware of, right?
Mhm.
A hidden hesitation or fear or something. Imir calls these side notes, and they're like gold mines of unconscious information.
Because they often reveal these like hidden desires or beliefs that the person might not even be consciously aware of.
Exactly. And the more you start to pick up on these side notes, the better you'll become at understanding what's really driving someone's thoughts and actions.
Okay, so this isn't about becoming some master manipulator, like using this information to get people to do what you want.
No, not at all. It's about deeper understanding, building stronger relationships, and having more authentic interactions.
That makes sense. So we've talked about the power of listening for those auditory cues, especially these side notes. What about visual cues? Like what are some of the nonverbal things we should be looking for?
Yeah, so visual cues, they're just as important, and often they kind of work together with the auditory stuff. Imir talks about paying attention to eye movements, micro expressions, even subtle shifts in posture.
Okay, so like with the eye movements, I've heard that people tend to look in a certain direction when they're accessing different parts of their brain, like if they're remembering something versus imagining something. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, Imir does touch on that, but she emphasizes that you don't need to be an expert in neuro-linguistic programming or NLP to like benefit from observing eye movements. Just notice if there's a sudden shift in their gaze, especially when you bring up a certain topic.
So if I ask someone about their weekend plans and they immediately glance away or their eyes dart around, that could be a sign that there's more to the story.
Exactly. Now, eye movements are great, but don't discount those micro expressions.
Doctorow expressions.
Yeah, like when someone tries to mask their true feelings with a smile, but for a split second, you see a flash of sadness or anger in their eyes.
Ah, those tiny little giveaways.
Exactly. And because they're so fleeting, they're really hard to control consciously, which makes them super revealing.
It's like our faces are betraying us even when we're trying to keep it cool.
Totally. And it's not just our faces. Don't underestimate the power of posture. You know how when two people are really connecting in a conversation, they often mirror each other's body language?
Right, it's like they're subconsciously in sync.
Exactly. So any sudden shifts in posture, like if someone who is leaning in suddenly crosses their arms or fidgets, it could mean something's changed in their emotional state.
So someone's all engaged, nodding along, and then I say something, and they immediately lean back and cross their arms, red flag.
Could be. But remember, it's not about analyzing every little thing in isolation. It's more about seeing how all these cues work together to paint a bigger picture.
Right, it's like trying to solve a puzzle,
Yeah.
You've got all these different pieces, and you're trying to fit them together to see the whole picture. Exactly. Now, Eymere also talks about something called the storyteller's trap. What is that, and how does it relate to all of this?
Okay, so imagine you're listening to someone tell you about an experience they had, but their delivery is, I don't know, kind of flat. Like there's no emotion in their voice. It's just like they're reading from a grocery list.
Okay, I've definitely heard that before, yeah.
Right, so that could be a sign that they're not fully present in the moment. You know what I mean? Like they're just reciting a story they've told a million times instead of actually connecting with the emotions behind it.
Interesting. So it's like they're going through the motions, but not really feeling it themselves.
Exactly. And that can be a clue that maybe they're unconsciously blocking themselves from fully processing or sharing their true experience.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap ourselves? And how can we help other people, like, break free from it if we sense that they might be caught in it?
Great questions. I think for starters, when you're telling a story, try to really connect with your own emotions and sensations. Don't just focus on the facts, bring those memories to life. Like, what did you see? What did you hear? What did you smell?
So instead of saying, I went to the park on Saturday, I might say, the minute I stepped into the park, the smell of freshly cut grass brought me right back to my childhood.
Exactly. By adding those sensory details, you're not just making the story more interesting for the listener, you're also deepening your own connection to the experience. And if you're on the listening end and you sense that someone might be stuck in the storyteller's trap, try asking some open-ended questions that encourage them to tap into their emotions a bit. Instead of asking, what happened next? Maybe try asking, how did that make you feel?
That's a great tip. So we've covered a lot of ground here, learning how to decode these unconscious signals through what we hear, what we see, even how people tell stories. But how do we actually use this in real life? Like, it seems kind of overwhelming to try to pay attention to all these little details while also trying to have a conversation.
Yeah, I hear you. It's a lot to take in. But don't worry, you don't have to become a mind reader overnight, right? Start small. Choose one or two cues that really resonate with you and start paying attention to those in your conversations.
So maybe I'll focus on changes in tone and those side notes we talked about. And once I'm comfortable with that, I can start adding in other things like eye movements or posture.
Right. It's all about practice. The more you do it, the easier it becomes. And honestly, don't overthink it. Relax, be present, and trust your intuition.
It's like learning a new dance or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
At first, you're stumbling all over your feet, but eventually it becomes second nature.
Exactly. And speaking of stumbling, let's talk about those conversations where the other person just won't stop talking. Those times when you're drowning in a sea of words. How do you even find those subtle cues then?
Oh, I've been there. Sometimes it's all I can do to keep up with the torrent of words, let alone analyze their body language.
So Eymere has a really interesting perspective on that. She says that those unconscious moments, the pauses, the contradictions, the nervous laughter, those are your entry points. Instead of trying to process everything, focus on those little moments where their unconscious peeks through.
So, like, if someone's going on and on about their weekend and their voice gets all high-pitched when they mention dinner with their in-laws, that's my cue to dig a little deeper.
Exactly. You might gently say something like, you mentioned dinner with your in-laws. How was that? It's like panning for gold, right? You're sifting through all the silt and sediment to find those little nuggets.
Okay, that's a great analogy. It's about finding those little entry points, those subtle shifts that allow us to steer the conversation in a more meaningful direction. Now, what about those times when things get emotional? Like, conversations don't always follow a logical path, right? Sometimes they take unexpected turns and emotions run high. How does this approach work in those situations?
That's where it gets really interesting, actually. Eymere's big thing is that when someone's having a strong emotional response, whether it's tears, anger, even laughter, the most important thing is to create a safe space for them to feel those emotions fully.
So instead of saying don't cry or it's not a big deal, we should just acknowledge and validate their feelings.
Exactly. You might say something like, I hear you're feeling really hurt right now, or it sounds like that really angered you. Just by reflecting their emotions back to them, you're showing them that you see them, that you hear them, and that you care.
And that can be incredibly powerful, right? Like
Ah,
just feeling seen and heard, especially in those vulnerable moments.
absolutely. And this is where it gets really cool. Eymere talks about these things called trans-emotional moments.
Okay, trans-emotional moments. Sounds intriguing, but also kind of mysterious. What does that even mean?
Okay, so think about a time when you felt a knot in your stomach because you were nervous. Or maybe you felt this warm sense of relief after a good cry. Eimer's theory is that those physical sensations, they're not just random reactions, they're actually symbolic representations of what's happening in our unconscious mind.
So, like, my stomach's not literally tied in knots, but that feeling represents some kind of anxiety or tension that I'm holding on to.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that sometimes simply acknowledging and exploring those sensations can actually help shift the underlying emotional state.
You mean just by saying something like, hey, I noticed you're touching your forehead. What are you feeling right now? That could actually help someone process their emotions more effectively.
Exactly. It's like you're shining a light on something that was hidden in the shadows, you know? By bringing awareness to those physical sensations, you're helping the person connect with their unconscious and gain a deeper understanding of what's going on inside.
This is reminding me of something we talked about earlier, how our unconscious mind often communicates through symbols and metaphors.
Yes. And when you learn to recognize and interpret those symbols, a whole new level of understanding opens up.
It's like we're becoming fluent in a whole new language.
Exactly. The language of the unconscious mind.
This is amazing. I feel like I have so many new tools to use now. But before we wrap things up, I want to make sure we talk about how to actually respond to these unconscious signals in a way that promotes healing and transformation. Like, it's one thing to recognize them, but how do we actually use this knowledge to help ourselves and others?
That's such an important point. Eymere is a big advocate for approaching these conversations with curiosity and compassion, not with an agenda. Remember, we're not therapists here. Our job is to listen, validate, and hold space for the other person to explore their own inner landscape.
So it's not about swooping in with solutions. It's more about being a compassionate witness to their experience.
Yes, it's about empowering them to tap into their own inner wisdom and find their own answers.
That makes sense. But practically speaking, how do we do that? Like, how do we respond to these unconscious cues in a way that's both supportive and empowering?
It's really about being present and observant and responding in a way that feels natural and supportive. So, for example, if someone's telling you about a stressful situation and you notice they keep clenching their jaw, you might gently say something like, I hear how much stress you're under, and I noticed you clenching your jaw. Are you feeling that anywhere else in your body?
Right? So you're not dismissing their experience or jumping in with advice. You're just kind of holding up a mirror to what you're seeing and hearing.
Exactly. And, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just listen, really listen.
Easier said than done sometimes.
True, but it's so important. Put your phone away, make eye contact, and just be fully present with them in that moment. Let them know that you're there with them, hearing not just their words, but everything else they're communicating as well.
Creating that space for them to really feel seen and heard.
Yes. And remember, you don't have to have all the answers. In fact, sometimes the best thing you can do is just let go of the need to fix things or offer solutions and just be a compassionate presence for the other person.
That's a good reminder. It's not about being a therapist or an expert. It's about being a friend, a confidant, someone who cares enough to really listen. Wow, this has been like eye-opening. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how much we communicate without even realizing it.
It's pretty amazing when you start to pay attention, isn't it?
It really is. And the coolest part is that this is something anyone can learn to do. It's not like you need special training or anything. It's just about being more mindful and paying attention to those subtle cues that we're all giving off all the time.
Exactly. And as you become more aware of these unconscious signals, you'll start to notice them everywhere. In your conversations with friends, family, colleagues, even strangers.
It's like a whole new world opening up. So
Yeah.
as we wrap things up here, I want to leave our listeners with this.
Yeah.
The next time you're having a conversation, really pay attention. See if you can spot those little giveaways, those unconscious signals that reveal what's really going on beneath the surface. It might surprise you what you discover.
It just might. And who knows, it might even transform the way you connect with the world around you.
Well said. That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing, and remember, there's always more to discover beneath